Hello everyone, welcome back to Pro AV TV. Thank you all very much for joining us today. We are doing another stream today on the Canon R5c, which has been just dominating our lives over here in the technical department for Pro AV for the last couple of weeks, as I'm sure it has been for my guest today, Ollie Kenchington. How are you, Ollie?
I'm very well. Nice to see you, Carl.
Nice to see you too. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure.
Has your couple of weeks been, if not month, been dominated by the R5c?
Well, as you can probably imagine, actually the last couple of weeks for me, it's finally kind of slowed down a bit, or certainly the past week. It's, very much 6 weeks before that, leading up to that moment was full on. Really didn't get any moment where my brain wasn't occupied with something to do with the R5c. But that's a good thing, to be honest. It's a great camera, so it was quite fun to have the opportunity to actually use it for so long. I mean, in the past I know when the C70 came out, I had it for a couple of days, maybe a week, I think, before the announcement. The C300
Which is very normal for product releases.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Most brands.
But I mean, partly the reason was because Canon UK wanted me to film this kind of case study of the camera being used in the hands of Lee and Stu, and this automotive kind of industry case study, which was partly the reason why I had it a bit longer, because I needed to shoot and produce that as well as my own first look film. So it ended up I've literally only just gone back a couple of days ago, actually. So. It's quite sad to see it go.
Yeah, won't be long till March till they're properly shut.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I hope it's not going to be a case of too many chip shortages. I think.
Who knows?
Hopefully,
who knows in 2022. Who knows? I think we're getting pretty decent stock allocation for the first one. Good. So hopefully people shouldn't be waiting too long. So today, the idea behind, really, my number one priority with this stream is I just wanted to get you on and have a simple chat about the camera. But what I thought would structure it quite nicely was about how the camera fits into the rest of Canon's lineup, if you like. It's something that people talk about with Canon launches quite a lot, and this is a very interesting and different camera for Canon. They've really done something with the R5c that we haven't seen Canon do for a very, very long time. And so a lot of the discussions we've had from customers is, well, what does this mean for this? And what does this mean for this? And what does this mean for this? And so I thought it'd be fun to break that down a little bit. So as we go through, just a reminder for people who don't regularly watch our live streams, I can see all of the chat and everything that's going on YouTube and on Facebook here on the laptop. So I'll be bringing any questions and comments in from all of you watching into the chat as we go. This is certainly not a chat between me and Ollie. This is all of us. I've got a voice here, so absolutely any questions as we go, just leave them down in the chat and I will bring them up when relevant. But
shall I get it up as well, actually, so I can also see the comments as they come in?
Yeah, you can do. Go for it. But big picture, we haven't spoken on camera yet about the camera. What do you think of it, Ollie?
It's awful.
It's awful. Dreadful camera. Worst camera that Canon have ever made.
I don't know what the fuss is about.
And end stream.
yeah. Okay, and good night. No, it's obviously great. It's really, really nice. It's one of those cameras that I don't think you really see fully the value of it because of its form factor and almost the intangible things about it, like the menu systems and the not having to think about any kind of recording limits at all. And I don't just mean the overheat limits that we had with the R5. I mean all 29-minute, 59-second type recording limits as well. Without any of that, it's one of these devices that until you're actually using it in anger and it's in your hands and you're going about your normal everyday kind of shoot activity, that you start to really understand some of the sort of important parts of this camera. And in a way, it's kind of cursed because it's an R5c and because it's the R5 with the bit on the back with the fan. In a way, it feels, and I felt like this certainly when I first heard about it, like, oh, okay, you kind of think you know what this camera is, and then you use it and your opinion changes. And my opinion changed quite a bit. Not that it was negative initially, but I just assumed I knew this camera. And then I actually used it. I was like, oh, no, okay, now I understand. And I've loved it. You know, it's just such a incredible image. It really comes down to that more than anything with me. It's a device that for certain projects where we're not going, and which happened quite a bit with us, because obviously we're not doing short films and drama, and you know, we're often not trying to achieve that more kind of filmic, softer look, which actually the C70 I think does really well. So quite often it's just a case of very, very high quality detailed imagery, or using, you know, like the 8K plates for something, for maybe for some visual effects or some background or textures, or, you know, there's those sorts of uses of it, which I guess Red owners would be very familiar with. Obviously Red's used a huge amount on drama, but it's also got that reputation of that incredibly detailed, color rich kind of image quality, and it kind of reminds me of that, which is funny because the C70 really reminds me of that more filmic look that you get from the Alexas, and I guess that's down to the DGO in it. But it is funny how Canon's other cameras, I've never really felt like, oh, that looks like this or that looks like the other. And I'm not the only person who I've spoken to who kind of thinks this way, that there's a definite kind of look to both the C70 and I think also with the R5c that lends itself to certain types of uses, and certainly types of aesthetics. But I love that high resolution detailed look from the R5 and the R5c.
Massively so. I mean, our latest batch of content that we're making over here on the R5c is taking all of the big side-by-side comparisons that we shot a load of when we had the camera, and now that we've not got the camera anymore, but we've got a bit more time away from launch, we're really putting them side by side with the C70, with the Sony A7S Mark III, with the R5, and really trying to dig into some of the differences and how each sensor looks. And the differences to the C70 are far more than I first expected. Yeah. And almost in these tests, I'm a little bit concerned about how the C70 is going to come across, because, as you say, it is a softer camera. You know, that's actually to its strength in some of the situations where the C70 is used. In that more cinematic world, Canon have never really aimed to make their cameras the most detailed that they ever could. And yet in these side-by-side comparisons, obviously, what am I doing? I'm looking at detail, I'm looking at noise and all this sorts of stuff. And the very technical, you know, aspects of a camera's sensor and recording modes. And I guess that's what we sort of do in lens world. If we compare what we're talking about to the lens world, which I think people are much more used to communicating the different look of a product. You know, just because one lens A and lens B is sharper, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that let's take the Cooke versus Zeiss argument that's been going for many years in high-end cinema. You know, the Zeiss Master Primes look lovely. They look very, very detailed. They look very modern, very clean. Cooks, when you do this sort of side-by-side next to them, won't look like that at all. Pretty much every single tick box going down the chart will go to the Zeiss. And yet most cinematographers prefer the Cookes, and the Cookes have this gorgeous look to them. And I think it's a similar sort of idea in some ways with camera sensors. Would you agree?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's kind of created a little bit of a split in, you know, we're talking about the lineup. Well, I kind of feel like the R5C almost feels like it should be in one side with the C500 Mark II, and then you've kind of got the C300 Mark III, C70, on the other side, because obviously that's the same sensor. That's far more kind of clear cut. But certainly the only other Canon camera or current Canon camera that I look at and I have that similar feeling of really detailed imagery is the C500 Mark II, which of course is the 5.9K full frame sensor. So in many ways, it stands to reason. It's got more of that type of look. I think probably on some kind of sliding scale, you'd probably have the most detailed, crisp image being the R5c, then the C500 Mark II, and then the C300 Mark III, and you'd probably kind of step through in that kind of range. But it has created this kind of balance in a way. There's kind of these tools, but it's nice because there's not necessarily been that kind of decision-making process hasn't ever really come into it for me when I've been thinking about what camera I might use for a specific job. I've not before had to kind of think too much about that. A little bit with the C500 Mark II in terms of that detail, but more often than not, I'm picking that camera because of its low light capabilities, so and the fact that I might need RAW from something that can give me that sort of higher than 4K. So in a way, it's kind of introduced new aesthetic concerns when you're picking a camera for a certain job with the current lineup.
Massively so. I think even just doing the I would say sort of bread and butter kind of work, your corporate brand film kind of work, there are moments in filming those things where you want the camera to be very, very sharp and detailed. Take the wide establishing shot or something like that. And A and B camera pair between the C70 and the R5c will absolutely let you do that. You can have it's not even an A and a B pair, really, is it? It's more two A cameras that are just very different. Well,
it's interesting you bring that combination up, actually, because I didn't buy the R5 because obviously there was an awful lot of noise during the early days because of the overheating, and then I didn't actually even use an R5 until after the firmware came out that solved those issues. And so I've only ever used an R5 post firmware V1 or whatever it was where that was sorted. So I've never had an experience with the R5 with any overheating. I've never actually even seen the overheat warning come on that camera. So it's not something that I've ever used. And I ended up not buying it. I think, do you know what? I don't know why. It was just kind of some kind of feeling that maybe it wasn't the best time to be jumping on that, although I had no prior knowledge of the R5c at all. Whereas when the R5c came out, there was completely the opposite. It was like, right, I need to get this camera. So where I've used the R5 as a partner camera, if you like, a B cam to our C70, which is kind of probably our most used main camera, initially I was using the R5 in that B cam position, so it was off center. The C70 was our main camera, our wider shot, mics running into it obviously, and sort of thinking of that as our main camera. But what I found was, because the R5 and the R5c now image is so crisp, it's so detailed, by comparison it was making the C70, which I'd never even thought of as soft in any way at all, soft in terms of highlight sort of handling, but not it didn't look like a soft image. When you put it next to obviously an 8K full frame sensor like that, it's kind of, obviously it highlights the differences in that sense. So initially I was like, oh, okay. So I was just adding a little bit, only a touch of post sharpening to the C70 just to kind of redress that. So as you cut from one to the other, it wasn't too noticeable. But actually I've come up with the perfect kind of solution, because what I've been doing and what I did with the interviews for that case study with Lee and Stu, so the interviews that were shot 2-camera with the C70 and the R5c, was I just swapped them round. So the wider shot is the R5c, and because it's more detailed, obviously you end up with that crisp image even though it's wider, and then the C70 being closer in, that brings back that kind of detail. So actually then they look far more comparable, just playing with the kind of the angles of it basically.
No, I think that's an absolutely brilliant way to look at them. We've got a couple of questions coming in which I just want to jump in with. McNeil Bell saying, so are you guys saying that the R5c has the best image quality out of all of the Canon cameras? I would stray away from words like best. Because it's a very multifaceted thing, image quality, and in some areas it is the best. It is the sharpest, most detailed image, certainly from the tests that I've seen so far. There are other areas like color rendition and dynamic range and things like that where I think other cameras have strengths. What do you think, Ollie?
Well, I think that dynamic range is the key thing there. I think if you're just thinking purely in terms of detail, yes, I mean it is, for obvious reasons it is. I think if you slightly broaden your definition and do start to factor in, which I think you absolutely should, the dynamic range of the sensor, then the C70 for me is still my go-to. It's absolutely killer, the amount of dynamic range you get from that sensor, and of course the C300 Mark III.
Because I sort of, in the back of my head, I know what the results that I haven't published yet of my my image quality comparisons are, which hopefully will be out quite soon. Dynamic range isn't all about highlight retention, whereas I see a lot of people test dynamic range by pointing it at a sky with clouds. You know, that's what people think of as dynamic range, is how much detail can I hold in my clouds. And that is only one aspect of dynamic range. And what the C70, I mean, I don't mind talking about the results because you'll want to see them anyway when they come out. I've found that the C70 actually doesn't have as much highlight information as the other cameras do in my side-by-sides. But where it really excels is in the shadow information, and presumably this is down to that DGO sensor. You'll know more than me, but the noise in the shadows, even when you're severely underexposed and pushing up on the C70, is beautiful. It's really really natural feeling. And the other cameras that I tested, like the A7S Mark III and the R5 and the R5c, just didn't do that. They looked far more digital in the shadow area.
Yeah, I think it's also excuse me, it's also things like saturation. I mean, I do a lot of work with the RHS, and so I mean, one shoot that really always stands out in my mind, and I'm sure I've shared examples of it when we've talked about the C70 last year, was this shoot that we did for the Chelsea Flower Show last year, where we were doing this little video package for them, and we were doing some walk and talk stuff and B-roll, and we just had the C70, and there's this one particular shot where we didn't even know what we were doing. There was so much content that the RHS were putting together for Chelsea, and they were just throwing stuff out there, and we had almost no time to prep. We didn't really know what we were doing when we got there, and we had very little time as well. So there was no one there to do anything. You know, there's no one there to hold a reflector. There was nothing. It was just literally me and a camera, and there was a sound recordist. And there's this one walk and talk where it's the middle of the day. It's whatever it was, May time. So the sun's really high. There was no cloud. Backlighting our presenter, who's got grey hair, black skin, and behind her were these plants, euphorbia, which are in this incredibly saturated acid green color with the sun beating straight down onto them. So there's this huge range of bright highlights, bright saturation, the bright sun reflecting on her grey hair, and the amount of detail that was in that image. It was just C-Log2, ISO 800. Exposed with the waveform, and just hit and go. We had no time, as I say, for even reflecting or bouncing light back into her, which obviously you would ideally want to do. And that image looks amazing. It's just one of those shots that I just look at, and it kind of meaningless to anyone else. It's not a particularly remarkable shot in itself, but just to look at it and think that was captured with this sensor, and the way it's held onto the shadow detail, you can see everything. And range is the key word in dynamic range, as you say. It's everything from black to white. It's everything in between, and the way that it's containing that, but also the way that it handles those high saturation areas as well, which is something that the DGO sensor is also doing. It's not just about luminance. So it's kind of incredible, that sensor. And I definitely don't feel with the R5c that I could walk into a situation like that and be able to get something where there wasn't some kind of compromise. Maybe we lost some of the highlights, something clipped off, or maybe we ended up with these horrible kind of blooms with the saturation or something. I'd be concerned about that far more. So that is an important part of assessing the image quality of a sensor. It's not just about resolution and detail, obviously.
Absolutely. So
having said all of that, I didn't at any point when I was using the R5c think too much at all about the fact it's obviously 14 stops versus 16 plus, and there's no DGO in it, so that there wasn't. I thought that I'd be a bit more conscious for that, particularly after a year or more of using that DGO sensor so much. And there were times where I was pointing the camera at things and thinking, is this going to be too much for it? slightly annoyingly, so one of the videos that I made with the camera was it's called Standing Stones, and it's shot
Just put
on
a link
sunrise.
to it in the chat for
Yeah, I
everyone
think
watching.
that'd be cool. It's an interesting one to look at. So it's sunrise, really very vivid, saturated colours in the sky, and there's all these people lined up and they're watching the sunrise. It's the first sunrise after the midwinter solstice in Avebury, and when I was grading it, I was conscious that actually the way it's graded, I think, looks right and looks and works well for the piece, but it looks a bit like there's no detail in the shadows.
Yeah,
and these files
sure.
are also available. If you look at the link to YouTube, you'll see in the description there's a link to actually download some of that stuff, the raw files from that shoot, and you can see for yourself there's tons of detail. I've actually darkened it and brought down and added some windows and just actually brought down the level on particularly the grass, just because it was distracting to the eye, and I wanted everyone to sort of watching it to be focusing on the area that I thought was most interesting. But if you look at the raw file, there's actually huge amounts of detail in this sort of the obverse side of the hill, which has got no sun on it whatsoever. It's frosty grass, and on like the backs of people with their clothes and stuff, you can actually see all of that detail. So the graded image kind of almost makes it look a bit, oh yeah, you can see it's not as good dynamic range, but actually I was surprised at how much detail it had retained in both the bright saturated sunrise in the sky, but also
multiple grades. You could
shadows.
take that one shot and do a video which is multiple grades of the same thing. Let's make it look like
it's on my list when I get some time to do an HDR grade of that, because
I'd love to see an HDR grade of that.
Show it off to its best, I think.
Definitely. I just want to crack through with some other questions because they're coming in thick and fast. So we've got a few autofocus questions. Pioneer Media saying that is the only difference between the R5c and the R5 the animal/vehicle AF detect when dealing with people? Is the AF on the R5c slower or acting differently? Yeah,
that's a really good point. So actually, I did jump in when you were on with Media. I was in the comments, and I tried to kind of chuck that in there. But when I heard the spec, so when I was first given the presentation by Canon about what this camera could and couldn't do, what you had in each menu, my first comment was, so what, you don't have the same, because it's the separate menu. I immediately thought, oh, hang on, does that mean that they don't have those autofocus modes with the vehicle and everything? And of course, once I got the camera, I realized that was actually the case. So my presumption was, oh, okay, so this is exactly the same autofocus capability. It will feel and work the same way as it does on my C70, because it's using the same technology in terms of the branding name. What do they call it? The ITX, or I always forget the exact name of it. But the C70 has that slightly better dual pixel autofocus where it will track back of heads. It's got that AI kind of augmented
on their spec sheet right now. It seems to be called dual pixel AF Mark II. Whereas that's very misleading.
Isn't that what the R5's got though? And the C70 has the ITX variant of it, the back of head stuff.
Yeah.
So on paper it should behave the same as the C70, and I don't have a massive problem with the way that C70 works, but obviously when you've used an R5 and the mind-blowing speed at which it can track particularly eyes, I was sort of disappointed. I was like, oh, okay, so that's not going to be quite as good, but it'll still be perfectly usable because we use the C70 all the time. As soon as I started using the R5c, it becomes immediately apparent that it's far closer in terms of the AF performance to the R5, even though you're in the video mode and in theory you don't have access to those photo menu video autofocus modes, which is a long way around of saying what I'm trying to say. The box on the eye, it tracks and moves. It felt like it did when I'm using it on the R5. People moving. I did some tests, and not all of it I've put up, but there was some low light tests I was doing actually, just of Christmas shoppers in the local town. And there's one shot where this little girl's walking up the street and she starts running, and the autofocus box is bang on her eye. It's quite low light and it tracks her seamlessly, and she's running like full pelt out of frame, and it tracks her all the way out. That's the type of thing that I've only seen when I've been using the R5. I've certainly never seen that. I mean, you technically don't have the eye autofocus box on the C70. It's whole face, so it's definitely closer in that regard to the R5. it doesn't have the vehicle and animal modes. And it seems to me, obviously the camera is physically capable of that. So one presumes that with time, as they start to refine the specific video menu on the R5c, because at the moment, obviously, it's the video menu from pretty much the C70 with some refinements. One presumes that potentially that will come maybe in time. I don't know. I've certainly not been told anything from Canon, but the only reason why that might be good is just to shut people up who want the animal in the cars. For me, it makes no difference. I'm never shooting vehicles and I'm never shooting animals. So
there are a lot of use cases.
Everyone's using them in different ways, but for me, the most important one is the eye tracking autofocus.
And I think
so.
I
was very relieved to find that it behaves far more like the R5 in that regard than the C70. It's very, very quick.
Yep. I completely agree. I mean, we're talking so much about the autofocus changes, but when you switch from video to stills and the software that is driving that, but the software isn't everything. The sensor, the amount of autofocus points, the the processor that is behind it, all of that stuff does have a massive impact on it. I haven't done side-by-sides yet for autofocus. I am getting the camera back at some point, so what I'm aiming to do when we do get it back is to stick it side-by-side with the C70 and do some autofocus tests.
It seems to be better in the low light as well, because that's
the R5 always was.
The C70 does struggle a bit as soon as the contrast drops. Or it's a darker object. It's not as snappy as the R5, and the R5c is similarly better in those sort of lower light autofocus scenarios.
John Kitchen says, does the R5c have the same face-only mode in video autofocus where it does not focus on the background when a face disappears from the scene, like in the C70 and C200? Yes, it does.
Yeah. And so you've got face priority and face only, and you've also got the speed and responsiveness, which is great. I think people, if they've not used these cameras before, the C series cameras with those functions, it's easy to just kind of forget that. But I'm constantly shifting between those depending on the subject that I'm filming. I mean, just yesterday I was filming some stuff at the RHS, and we have people doing demonstrations, and there's two cameras, and I was on the camera with the longer lens, and I'm trying to track and follow what people are doing with their hands. And that tracking responsiveness is really important for if I'm tapping on someone's hand and they're grabbing something and their hands moving quickly across the frame. I need that responsiveness to come up. If I'm doing an interview, I want that responsiveness to come down a bit. If I'm doing 50 frames B-roll and I want to do some sort of artificial focus pulls without me having to do it, I'll drop the speed right down to -5, and I'll just tap on the screen and let it do it itself. And of course with the 50p you can get some really lovely slow focus pulls that way. So if you've not used that before, it's
stuff
you might not
can't do on the R5. Film production agent Chain Shot, which is a great name, says, has Canon ever thought of an advanced grip unit with more controls for future cinema cameras? I feel the need for some sort of ARRI master grips equivalent for the C500 Mark II, especially on solo gimbal jobs. It's a great idea. What I would say is that the grip unit from the C300 Mark II and the C500 Mark II can be extended with cables, so you can put that grip unit in other places, onto a gimbal or down on hand grips for a shoulder rig, things like that. So that might get you some of the way there. But I'll pass that back to Canon. It's an interesting one.
Can I just pick up on one question I've just seen?
Go for it.
So Nanki,
yes, I've seen those further down.
Why don't we have C-Log 2 on the R5C? I can't understand. I've seen this a lot. It's been one of the most frequent things that I've seen popping up in a lot of comments, and where I've watched other, like when Media was on with you. Yep. I can't stress enough, C-Log 2 is a gamma curve that's designed for a camera sensor that has a certain number of stops of dynamic range. It was introduced when I think it was when the C700 first came out, or was it the C500? Whichever camera came out, which was the first Canon cinema camera that had 15 stops of dynamic range. Yeah, that's why they brought out C-Log 2, because they had a sensor that was capable of a greater dynamic range of what had come before, where you only had C-Log 3, and they needed a gamma that could make the most of that. And the way it makes the most of that is by giving you an extra stop in the shadows.
Yep.
So C-Log3 and C-Log2 are identical from middle grey up. There's no difference between them whatsoever. The only difference between C-Log2 and C-Log3 is that C-Log2 gives you an extra stop, so you've got an extra brightening, if you like, down in the shadows, because it can bring up an extra stop of detail with the right sensor. If you put C-Log2 on a sensor that doesn't give you that much dynamic range, then all you're doing by bringing it up with that C-Log2 gamma is you're revealing the noise floor. You're not revealing detail, you're revealing noise. That's why they didn't have C-Log2 on the C200, because it didn't have a sensor with dynamic range that would support it. So the C200 never had access to C-Log2, and it's why you won't see it on cameras that don't have that capability. That it's a 14 stop sensor, so C-Log3 is perfect. If you put C-Log2 on there, which you can do, so if you wanted it, if you really didn't believe me and you're like, no, he's wrong, you can take the raw file, and of course it's raw, so you can apply any gamma you like to it. You could apply
actually Resolve sticks it in C-Log2 by default, because it tripped me up in all my side-by-sides. I was like, why does the raw look so different in some of these?
Well, Resolve is not thinking about the dynamic range of the sensor. It's just doing a default adjustment based on the fact that it can see it's cinema raw light. Yep. And I suspect that it's always done that ever since cinema raw light was first introduced, rather than it specifically thinking about the camera and the sensor there. If you really want to, you can of course develop it as C-Log2 using either Canon's cinema development tools or Resolve, or whatever you want to use. But all you're going to find, you may feel like, oh yes, I've beaten Canon, but all you're going to find is that you're revealing parts of the image which aren't helpful to you really. Of course, it depends how you've exposed. But if you've exposed to the point where you've gone above that noise floor, then all C-Log2 is going to do is reveal that, but you're going to be losing stuff at the other end. It's such a complex thing, and it's one of the biggest educational kind of things that I come up against. Obviously, I do a lot of training, I do a lot of events, and probably the most common question is, what gamma should I use? And it reveals a complete misunderstanding of what gammas are and what they're for. But people, I think too often they get told, or they hear from others, that one gamma is better than another and they should always use it. So I can see why those people, if they've got that mindset, might go, well, hang on, C-Log2 is the best. That gives you the most dynamic range, therefore I should be using it, or therefore this camera doesn't have it and it's no good. It only gives you the maximum dynamic range if you pair it with a sensor that is capable of recording that dynamic range. The gamma itself is a simple mathematical transform. It would be like saying, I need that LUT, otherwise, my grade is going to look awful. I must have this LUT, not any other LUT. It's the same thing. It's just a mathematical transformation. It's only as good as what's being fed into it. Basically, very clear cut. Take it from me. It is not a problem that the R5c doesn't have C-Log2 gamma in it. It really isn't. It would be meaningless to put it in there. And I don't want to throw mud, but there are other manufacturers that, because of this response and because of the perceived almost too much weight put on this, they do put in gammas that are not appropriate to the dynamic range of the sensor that's actually in their camera, because they don't want to deal with all this kind of they don't have to educate their users. They want to sell cameras, so they just stick it in there. And then what happens is, over time you realize, hang on, this camera really shouldn't have this in there. I mean, I think most people would agree and accept that S-Log3 had absolutely no place in the A7S2, and yet it's there. But once you start using it, you're like, hang on, all this is doing is revealing noise, and everyone tends to end up using S-Log2. It's no different. We're talking about exactly the same situation. A gamma should be partnered with the dynamic range of the sensor. Sorry.
Okay. We are just moving on to a couple of other questions. Talking of dynamic range, Elias says, in the car IBIS comparison, which I think he's referring to my video on image stabilization, between the R5 and R5c, I thought the dynamic range of the R5c was clearly better than that of the R5. Was there was detail in the grass and in the car seat, while the R5 had nothing. Am I wrong? No, you're not wrong. That was very, very clear. There was some very noticeable picture differences between the R5 and the R5c in that test, which as soon as I saw it back on a computer, I wanted to dive into a little bit more and figure out what on earth was going on there. I've seen some of it also in the side-by-sides which we shot separately, which we're going through at the moment now. The R5c does handle the highlights slightly better, and it handles the shadows very differently to the R5. The bit that I don't understand, which maybe Ollie you can you know more than me, was the color differences. The saturation and particularly a bit more magenta and things like that were very different between the two cameras, and the R5 was very magenta in some of our stuff, and things like the greens in the grass, for example, was very different in the R5 than it was in the R5c, despite both being in the same C-Log and the same cinema gamma, and I believe they both have the same sensor. Neutral color matrix, they were the same as far as I remember putting them into. I mean, it's possible I made a mistake. It's very possible. I was making those very quickly.
It's difficult. I've not used the R5 very much at all, so it's difficult to know. And also these differences, some of them are blatantly obvious, and some of them are very subtle, and you only notice if you're shooting charts and measuring it. All I can say is I noticed when I was doing my ISO, my noise tests with the R5c. I just had the body cap on and just ramped through all of the different codecs and all of the different ISOs and the two different base sensitivity settings. And I noticed, and I mean, you would be hard pressed to see this without doing what I did, which was zooming right in. But I did notice that there was an ever so slight shift towards magenta, I think when you were on the lower base sensitivity, so let's say 800, that went away when you were on the higher one.
This is in the R5c?
Yeah, on the R5c. So I don't know about the R5 because I just haven't shot on it enough. I've certainly not done any tests with it like this. So clearly, I think flicking from one circuitry to the other for some reason was having it wouldn't have been that it's changing the color of the look, but it's more that
there's more. They were a lens cap test, weren't they? So it's
exactly. Yeah. So it was more that there was more random firing, if you like, and stimulation of the magenta side of things. So it was subtle. You had to really zoom in on the vectorscope to see it, but it was just slightly up towards magenta where it wasn't. And I noticed it first in the whole image, just looking at the whole image, and then I kind of zoomed in on the vectorscope to see if I could physically see it on there, and I could. So I don't know what that's about, and I don't know if there's an element of that coming from the R5 as well. The dynamic range thing, I think that just comes down to the profiles. Obviously, the video profiles in the video menu have come from the video team that have developed those video profiles over however long. So I wonder if that could just be a difference in terms of the way that those profiles are being applied. But yeah, it is actually something that I think you really need to speak to a Canon engineer about and see if you can find out exactly what's going on. But so far, I think that kind of information is fairly limited. I did ask Canon for a dynamic range chart to see how the dynamic range was affected based on what ISO you're on, and they weren't able to provide that information at that time. So, but they do provide information like that for their other cinema cameras. So maybe that will come with time. But there's a number of unknowns, I think, at the moment in terms of what's going on with the way that they're kind of doing that. From what I can see, they're all positive, so it's fine. But it's good to really understand how the camera works and where the sweet spots are to obviously help you when you're filming make those decisions.
Absolutely. Carl is picking up on our previous chat about sharpness on the C70, and he's saying, is Ollie using the C70 with the 0.71 times adapter? That might be the reason for some of the softer look. I don't believe you were you, Ollie?
No, I almost never do. I have that adapter, but I very, very rarely use it because I've now got a fairly healthy stock of RF lenses and don't often have to use them. Occasionally I use the 16-35 with it, but yeah, no, it wouldn't have been that. No, I very rarely use that.
And in my tests that are coming out soon, we got the C70 both with and without that adapter, and it's still not as sharp.
Yeah.
Which is fine. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a difference.
Yeah, it's just exactly. It's just that sensor.
John says, how will the C70 utilise a DGO sensor when shooting in RAW? I guess like the C300 Mark III, right, Ollie?
Yeah, I mean, it will. It's happening at the sensor level, so that amplification and that dual gain circuitry is before the image has been debayered and gone through the system. So so it's happening at the sensor level. So whether you're shooting RAW or XFAVC or HEVC, you're benefiting from that up to 60 frames per second. So it'll be exactly the same. I have had a little play with it actually, and the only noticeable difference that I've seen is nothing to do with the dynamic range, but it definitely looks sharper with the RAW on the C70 with the new firmware. So which is good, because that's obviously
something that
one
helps.
of the looks of that sensor, which would make it maybe a bit easier to match that look if you're using it with an R5c.
Especially considering the low data rates of that RAW implementation. You know, it's not that much more inconvenient really to shoot with the RAW on the C70 when that is released than it is to shoot in XFAVC. The data rates are not too dissimilar.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I really think it's going to. I mean, it's very early days, still sort of testing the firmware, but it's definitely a new dimension to that camera, which muddies the waters of what I was saying before about, you know, the uses and the looks of those two cameras. It definitely looks sharper, more detailed. I did some tests with it in a bookstore. I wanted to find something there was lots and lots of little details everywhere. So there's obviously books everywhere. There's like a clock, some stuff that I've shot that's very detailed, both wide and close, to try and kind of test and see if that changed. And to my eye, from the limited sort of tests I've done so far, it's definitely making the image sharper and look a bit more like the R5c actually, which is cool, which is a good thing, I think.
Absolutely. Excited to play with it. I haven't tried it yet. Okay. Furkan says, how does the Super 35 mode perform with Super 35 lenses? Are there any disadvantages when the sensor cropped, or does it just behave like a normal Super 35mm camera? Behaves normally. In fact, you get a lovely 5.7K RAW from it. It's a really lovely picture. I mean, obviously compared to the full frame, you're going to be cropping in, so you're going to get slightly more obvious noise and slightly less sharp picture and all of those sorts of things that you would normally get from cropping into any sensor. But yeah, you can absolutely treat it like a Super 35mm sensor. If you've got Super 35mm PL lenses, for example, is quite a common one that we've run up against with customers.
I did a very quick and simple test. Pointed the camera at the moon and shot in the different, so LT, ST, and HQ. So obviously in the HQ it cropped into that S35 mode, and those files are available to download. They're in that Dropbox link that's on my first look in the description on there. Yeah, it's interesting because that cropping in it's still very detailed. You can look up from one to the other and you don't notice that there's suddenly a very distinct softening of the image at all. Particularly, obviously, assuming you're going into a 4K timeline, you've got that little bit of extra resolution as you bring that down anyway. So I did find that HQ, that crop looked good. You know, it looked good. Sometimes it's really useful to go into that mode just to get a little bit of length out of your lenses if you're in a situation where you just need a bit more and you don't have the lens to do that, or you're in a sort of a tight squeeze. It can be really useful, but it's not useful if the image looks soft. Some cameras, those crop modes, they just suddenly look quite soft. But I didn't find that was my experience when I was going into the HQ cropped f35 mode on the.
It's still 5.7K. You know, that's twice as many pixels as 4K.
Yeah. It's still a C500 Mark II.
Exactly.
Type, almost.
Not too bad. Elias is saying, does the R5c also downsample from HD 1080 and 720p? I know it downsamples the 4K. Yeah, everything in the camera that isn't a really high frame rate, so I believe it's over 60p, downsamples. I don't think the camera has 720p though. I think it only goes down to
No,
1080.
I wouldn't have looked for it, but no, I think 1920 1080 is going to be your lowest resolution.
I might be wrong on that. It might have 720p, but I don't remember seeing it. Where did I get to? Dun dun dum. Okay, is there any noticeable difference, Basecamp Film says, in autofocus speed between native RF and EF with the Canon drop-in ND filter? Cheers, Simon. In terms of a technology, no, RF isn't inherently faster than EF, but the RF lenses are, of course, all brand new. They've got very good focus mechanisms in them, and so the autofocus does tend to be very good on most of the RF lenses. RFL lenses, some of the more affordable RF lenses, the video autofocus is not particularly anything to write home about, and you'd be better served with an EF lens. But
yeah, it's tricky. I'm using my EF lenses hardly ever actually now, so I've got very used to working with the RFs. But certainly, when I've used the EFs with any of the adapters, but particularly with the Vari ND adapter, I've not noticed any change at all in the performance of the AF.
Nor have I. Just the inherent differences from different lenses.
I think it might make a difference to noise. You might hear those motors a bit more clearly, maybe with the older USM motors on some of the lenses, possibly. But in terms of speed, I don't think it would. I've certainly not seen any difference in speed.
And Marlo chimes in on that, says, wasn't the only difference between using RF and EF that the communication and coordination between the lens IS and digital IS isn't there. That is something. It's not the only the difference. Basically, RF has far more data points and a far bigger transmission channel, if you like, for data between the lens and the camera, and so communication can happen much faster, and so Canon can squeeze more out of it, which the RF was launched alongside the EOS R and a couple of those lenses, and we started to see what it could do, but it wasn't really much of a difference. Now with cameras like the R5 and the R3, we are starting to see a bit more difference, and I'm sure in the future we will unlock more and more of what that communication system between lens and camera can do. I don't think Canon are still using, from the impression I get, is that they're not using a lot of that potential yet. It's designed for the next 10 years, that lens mount. How long's EF been around, for example? They just wanted to make sure they had more bandwidth, basically, when they made a new lens mount. It's that communication bit. But the areas where we are seeing the most use of that, which I guess is why Marlo thinks it's to do with IS, is the digital IS working in tandem with the lens IS is a way that Canon are currently using that, if that makes sense. That was a bit rambly, but hopefully that made sense.
We had a laugh, actually, or certainly I had a laugh the other day, because we were talking in preparation for this call, and I said, I'll send across some BTS images to you, and I was working my way through them, and every single shot I'm there hand holding the R5c, shooting all the B-roll of Lee and Stu with the Lexus, and I had to chuckle because I've read so many times so many comments of people like, this camera is unusable handheld. Yep. And it just made me chuckle. I was just like, all of these images of me, BTS images of me hand holding the camera. Yep. So yes, trust me, it is usable handheld. But yeah, the RF IS, having both on the digital IS and the optical IS on the RF lenses is a really nice combo. Obviously, you get access, therefore, when you've got that combination to the full 5-axis stabilization that the camera is capable of doing. And I use it all the time. I was using it yesterday with the C70 on for some handheld B-roll that we were grabbing at this job for the RHS. I use it all the time. It's great. So yes, you can use the R5c handheld. I've done it a lot.
A really interesting one, actually, from Film Production Agent to Change Shot. So will Canon orient their new releases towards conventions like NAB in the future, or will they be free of that since, COVID and stuff? It is a bit of a trend we've seen over the last couple of years, where the camera releases are being spread a little bit more evenly throughout the year rather than all being grouped for trade shows. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? I don't think the manufacturers themselves know what's going to happen.
No, but I mean, I would imagine that if they've scheduled something that they think they might, they might release in the autumn, go and in the future when everything's back to normal. I would be surprised if they didn't say, well, why not just tie it together with, say, IBC or something, or if it's in April or the spring, why not tie it together with NAB? But I think certainly if something doesn't fall vaguely near a show in future, I don't think anyone's going to hesitate about releasing it now, probably.
No, I agree.
Because I think the last couple of years have demonstrated that it doesn't almost matter. I mean, look how much we're talking about the R5c, and that was announced in January.
Yes, exactly. Trade shows haven't been part of the picture at all. Cameron Dennis says, can you talk a bit more about the new firmware coming out for the C70? What's your experience with it, Ollie? I'll pass that over to you very definitely. I haven't used it at all.
No, I can't really talk too much about it, to be honest. Other than what I've said, I'm in the process of... I've had access to it recently in order to feed back to Canon and do some tests with the raw firmware. And as I mentioned earlier, the what I've seen so far is really good. But there'd be no point in sort of commenting beyond that, just because it's a little way away from that firmware being released, and will be no doubt going through various changes before it finally ends up being pushed out as a gold master. So there's not really much point saying more than that, other than yes, I've used it, and it looks really good so far.
So I want to talk a little bit about, the stream's called How It Fits Into the Lineup, which we haven't really discussed actually in much detail at all yet. Whoops, bad hosting on my part. I think it's because so many questions have been coming in, so thank you everyone for those. What I was picturing when trying to figure out what to talk about for this stream was what I like to think of as 3 different core areas of users and sort of target audiences. Manufacturers like to break it up into really fine little detailed target audiences, when I prefer to think a bit more bigger picture. I like to think of mid-range, so most people making professional video content. I think we'd put both of our work in this category, Ollie. I'd imagine people doing the corporate brand films, all of that sort of work. Maybe have access to multiple cameras. They will spend the money on decent tools for what they do, because they know that they're going to make that money back. They if it unlocks new things for them professionally, they will upgrade to it. It's the sort of market that the Sony FX6 has been very popular in, the Canon C70, that sort of world. There's then what I call I don't really have a good name that I like for it, but the group just below that perhaps buy one camera, and they're really pushing themselves to buy that one camera that they need to be a real production workhorse to launch their career. You buy one 87S or just this, they're really pushing to get this R5c, and then that is their sole camera that they are going to do as much as they possibly can. And these might be people filming weddings, they might be filming small corporate things, that sort of stuff. Might be filming short films just with very little budget, that sort of work. Normally in very small crews, normally themselves, maybe with a mate helping out with the bags. And then you've got high-end production. This is a crew. This is 30 people there all around the rig. You've got focused pullers, you've got directors, all of that stuff, a proper production. How do you think the R5c changes the landscape for Canon Cinema EOS in each of those 3 areas? Because I really think it touches all 3 of them in a massive way.
Yeah, I think the thing is, as you go up that scale, you find more opportunities to look back and choose across. So people who are at that sort of earlier initial phase of what you've just discussed, they may want to be able to use multiple tools, but they might not be able to afford to hire them in, or might not have access to them. Whereas from the top down, it's different. You know, if you've got a specific shot you want, and it would make sense to use a camera that's physically small, for example, then you can just go and grab that. I think you're right. I think it does change. I think the R5c and probably most. There are a number of reasons, but one of the ones that immediately springs to mind is that multi-accessory shoe, and therefore the ability to add, say, the Tascam XLR module. I think things like that, in partnership with the R5c, make it more of that camera that initial purchase. That's your one camera.
Absolutely.
I'm going to do everything with this.
I think it's
that's
the best jack of all trades camera that Canon have ever made.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I agree, actually. Yes, it would be great if there were internal NDs. I don't know how on earth someone could do that. I was amazed that they managed to do it with the C70. But I'd be even more amazed the day that someone cracks that in something that physically small. But one presumes that that might happen in the future. But even that aside, with everything about the way that this camera works, the way that those modules can work, whether it's a top mic or whether it's the XLR module, I think you end up with something that is far more useful in a lot of situations and could be easily your sole camera. As you say, as you go through, for me, it's more of a camera that I would want to have alongside something else, not as necessarily as a B camera, but certainly in my bag at the same time, so I could decide, and I think it would be useful for various different scenarios. And just because of the cost, if nothing else, we can easily afford to have an R5c and a C70 and take them out on shoots physically in the same bag at the same time using the same lens system. So why not? You've got extra choices available to you. And then, as you say, I think as you move up to the sort of bigger productions, obviously you can rig up all of these things. There's countless kind of examples of people rigging up mirrorless cameras with, to make them bigger. That kind of workaround isn't something that really people on big productions do. They just buy a camera that's designed for that. So there's a reason the C300 Mark III and the C500 Mark II have that body, and the C700 have those bodies and those the ability to grow and have so much extra kind of in-out on them. And that's really where big productions need that stuff. But they also necessarily need, for example, to have something that's small. I think something that can be mounted somewhere. Where obviously we've looked at a lot at the use case in terms of automotive, but crash cams, just getting a different kind of look, or actually the other way around, getting the same look, because the image quality obviously is mind-blowing out of this camera, and it really is on a par, if not better, to the other bigger cinema cameras as well, more expensive cinema cameras in quite a few ways. So that gives you the option to say, well, we're shooting everything C500 Mark II, but we need these shots. Maybe it's a body cam rig, or maybe it's a particular shot idea that someone's got for something, and you can now grab this tiny camera and rig it and kind of forget it. You don't have to worry about those recording limits. And you're going to get an image that will cut in perfectly, absolutely seamlessly with stuff that you might be getting from, even something like the C500 Mark II. So, yeah, it does. It gives more options, really, doesn't it? It's nice to see. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that all cameras pretty much had the same form factor, and those days are really quickly disappearing, aren't they? There's now seems to be different bodies, different formula, different ways of building them up, or whatever it might be, and rigging them, varying and new options almost daily, which is exciting, because obviously you can do all kinds of clever things with these cameras when you can put them in these spaces you might not have been able to before.
Absolutely. The amount of power that we're getting out of such a small camera nowadays is mind-blowing. If you showed this camera to us all 5 years ago, we'd fall off our chairs, really, wouldn't we? Cool. So I think that is the... actually, have I got any other little questions? Quick one, Camera Dennis says, regarding the C70's raw firmware, Ollie, did you use it in Resolve? Is it usable out of the box, or do we need an update for Resolve to be able to use it? Basically, can you open that raw format in anything right now?
Well, yes, I did, because I don't have any special tools. I wasn't given access to any kind of special software to do it, and yeah, it just recognised it. But then in the same way, the R5c came up and even had the camera name popping up in Final Cut Pro when I was editing with that, and that was obviously months before,
it was released.
So yeah, a lot of this stuff is
sorted out behind the scenes.
It's fairly rudimentary. I mean, a cinema raw light file is a cinema raw light file as far as Resolve is concerned, and it doesn't seem to be any kind of, or certainly in the beta firmware that I've looked at so far, there didn't seem to be any reason why it wouldn't or would require any kind of update or anything. Having said that, I know that Blackmagic are very keen to integrate new options, and certainly when it comes to RAW, there might be new things that they might introduce to it. So they might well tweak, and there may well be a software update afterwards that supports additional functionality potentially. But yeah, in the limited tests that I've done so far, I didn't have any problems accessing the files in Resolve.
Just going to quick fire through a couple of others. Sleep Vision Studio says, what's the highest resolution and frame rate so I can record onto SD cards? I can't remember them off the top of my head right now, I'm afraid, but I did put that in my first look video of the C70. I built a little chart that had tick boxes as to what you needed CF Express cards for and what you could use onto SD cards. So I would go back and look at that for the most accurate information. I don't know how to say your name, I'm afraid there, but he says, is the micro HDMI soldered or screwed onto the main board? Is it easily repairable, since that thing will break at some point for sure? I would definitely recommend using it with a cable clamp to stop it breaking as much. If it does break, the best way to deal with it is to get in touch with where you bought it from. If you bought it from us, we'll help you with that. And Canon have got a fantastic repairs scheme here in the UK called CPS. We'll be able to get that fixed for you whenever it does happen, but it will require a camera to go back to Canon. Janu says, is there face only options in autofocus selection so that when the face is out of frame it just locks the focus? Yes there is. And James says, R5c stripped down, minimal setup versus somewhat rigged or fully rigged. What are your thoughts? Do you like to rig up your cameras, Ollie, or do you like to keep them very bare bones?
It's too hard to answer. I think that every shoot's different. In our bag, in our kit bag, we have side handles, top handles, cages. We have base plates with rods. We have matte boxes. We have everything that we might need. Do we always use it all the time? Absolutely not. I think that's one of the nice things about these small cameras, is that you can rig them up so incredibly quickly, because the camera's smaller, everything else is smaller. So it was a bit of luck really, but the R5 cage, the small rig R5 cage that I had kicking around anyway, that just fitted on the R5C perfectly, because it kind of mounts from the front, so the fact that it's different at the back was kind of neither here nor there. So that was a bit of luck. So when I was shooting it, and you can see it in a lot of the BTS stuff, in fact I think if I...
Let's just cut to his full screen. I think it's killed your audio, by the way, Ollie. If you can still hear
me. You lose my audio, don't you, when I cut that? Sorry. All right. Well, anyway, there's that.
That image has
that image that you just saw briefly. Here you go. Look, I'll shut up for 2 seconds.
There we go. Yeah, so you can see he's got the small rig handle
take
there.
A screenshot. It's so that was with a side hand. That was me on, I think it was on the second day, where we were filming all the stuff around the location where they were taking some of the static kind of still stuff of the Lexus. So that was with a side handle. It's a bit of a Franken rig. I think it was a small rig cage, a small rig side handle, a bright tangerine top handle. Various things. I've got the Shinobi on the top there, which I often use. I think there's no one way I rig up the camera all the time. I will often, I think the most common setup is I'd have it with a cage, with a top handle, with a monitor mounted on it, and probably that's it. And then I would just have that on sticks, and then if I need to then move the system that I use with the particularly with the C70, with the bright tangerine left field cages, I can go from my Sackler Flowtech legs straight onto a DJI RS2, for example, using the same, it's got the same integrated dovetail plate on the bottom, so I can come off that, or I can go straight into the base plate with the rails if I need to put a matte box on there. So yeah, I think you come up with a system that kind of works, and I've got a big 45-litre Peak Design backpack that's got 2 sort of camera cubes in it, and one's got all of the various different kind of grip, and then one's got all the cameras and lenses, and I just grab and rig up. With these NATO rails these days, you can click things on and mount stuff really quickly. I've even jimmy rigged a little V-mount plate so that with a NATO clamp, so I can quickly clamp that onto the side of my cage if I need to run extra power for stuff. So you know, with the R5c, I was doing that with a dummy LP6 cable, which was good if you're doing time-lapse stuff, or if you needed to run the camera for extended periods of time, because I found, I don't know if I've got any kind of within arm's reach, but with the Anton Bauer Titan Micro 45 watt hour batteries, they're tiny, little tiny V-locks. I got 4.5 hours of continuous recording with the R5c using that. And with the Anker PD battery, the 26,000 whatever one it is, I actually gave up with that test. I got bored. I think it's going to be somewhere in the region of 12 hours plus with that battery. I ran it, so in record, the screen luminance was on +2, had the autofocus on, and I just set it up just here facing towards me, so it was tracking my face. Just constantly recording whilst I was doing some editing the other day, and I think about 4 hours in, I checked the battery, and you can click on the actual battery, and it shows you the power indicator. And there's something like, I don't know, 16 little lights around it, so there's plenty of increments to show where the battery is. And I pressed it, and it was still showing all the lights.
All full.
I was like, oh, I can't be bothered to sit here into tomorrow.
It's going to take a while.
So I just gave up. But yeah, that's a kind of a new element in terms of rigging the camera, because now I'm starting to think about ways that I might rig up. I saw some people talking about having them like just in pockets with long USB leads, but I don't know about that. But it would be nice to see a smaller capacity PD battery that could be mounted kind of a bit more easily, or some kind of way. I think there is actually I think SmallRig make a battery. An Anker style battery grip with a 1/4" 20 on it, which could be quite an interesting way of mounting it easily. Same
sort of way people mount SSDs and things like that to small cameras.
Either to the camera or to, like my tripod,
true.
has a 1/4" 20 hole on it. So
that would be a very nice way to do it, actually. And if you're constantly going between tripod and handheld, just taking the cable out and going handheld off battery power, whack it back on, back into the USB for tripod work. Great.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's about the reasons why you want to rig it up, isn't it? I mean, I love shooting completely without anything on the camera, particularly if I'm doing anything up to my eye, because I do really enjoy shooting video like that, particularly for anything events or something like that, where I'm trying to disappear a little bit as a camera operator and not be noticed. Going into photography mode is such a brilliant way of using cameras like this for me. So for that, obviously, I just wouldn't want anything on the camera at all. If you're going to plug anything on the HDMI, I really would recommend going for a cage to keep that nice and safe and secure with a clamp. That would be definitely something that would make me want to rig it up more in a cage. And like you say, the power, do I need longer than LP6s are going to give me? Because they do last a reasonable amount of time with the camera.
It's not too bad, yeah.
I got an hour.
Oh, did you? Oh, that's good. I think I got about 40 minutes. One of the problems that we had on the shoot with Lee and Stu is that, and not just us shooting them, but them shooting with it, was the demo cameras that we had came with one LPE6NH battery, but all of the batteries that we had, certainly me, because I up until very recently had still my old EOS R, so the batteries I had were the LPE6N. Not high capacity ones. And so those were only lasting about 25 minutes or so. So, but then I had 6 of them, so it wasn't a huge problem. I've because of all of this, and I've pre-ordered the R5c, and I've sold the EOS R, I've actually just got rid of all of those old batteries and just bought fresh LPE6NH batteries. I was getting about 45 minutes on those.
We had some very strange results in our battery test. Like, we got an hour off the Canon LP6Ns, Hs. But then our SWIT ones that we sell, which are quite not that high capacity, and they're not that high in amperage or anything like that either. They're quite underpowered in terms of technical specs, those little LP6 ones that SWIT make, but was powering it for like an hour and 20 minutes, so longer.
That's interesting.
Than it. But the communication was all over the place. It said it was going to last for like 3 hours, and then it died at like an hour left or something like that.
Status you need
screen.
That reliability, really. That's why I've never personally. That's why I've personally never bought third-party batteries, just because I've been burnt years ago, and I tend to avoid them now. It's just that communication. I want to know if I've got 5 minutes left. I need to know that it's exactly.
The Canon one was absolutely.
It becomes more important.
With its estimates.
It becomes more important with a battery that is lower capacity. If you've only got starting off with 40, then actually that 5 minutes at the end could be quite significant. Obviously, with the bigger batteries, the BP batteries that we use with the C70, you kind of don't think about it. And by the time it's down to 15, 20 minutes, you're like, you've almost finished the day maybe, or you just think, I'll just grab the next one, and then I really don't need to think about it. But that's why I think it's quite interesting, these sort of micro V mount and PD batteries, because particularly the PD battery, you wouldn't have to think about battery at all. It's definitely not for that day, possibly even the next day either.
Doesn't it even charge the LP6 that's in the camera?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, at the same time. So even once that's done, once you did finally exhaust that PD battery, you'd then still have a fresh internal battery to go for another 30, 40, 50 minutes, however long. So
thinking about it, when you were filming with, and you were quoting those 45 minutes a second ago, was that in the 4K XFAVC mode?
Yes,
it would have been, because our battery tests were part of our overheating tests, and those were done in the 8K 30 RAW. I wonder if that, almost counterintuitively, is actually using less power than having to
it won't be doing any encoding, will it?
Exactly.
Assuming you're not proxy recording, if the camera's not having to do any kind of encoding none of the normal sharpening, noise reduction, all those things that happen when you debayer and then encode it into XFAVC or HEVC or H.264, one presumes that's obviously keeping the processor load much lower, and therefore giving a bit of extra battery life. That might explain it.
Maybe. Anyway, I think that is a great place to end it there. If we haven't got back to any questions, anyone watching at home, I'm very sorry about that. Leave them down below in the comment section after this video goes out as a watch on demand, and we will do our best to get back to you after the end of the stream. But I think that's been really interesting. Thank you so much for joining me once again, Ollie. Thank
you, mate.
I'm looking forward to playing a bit more with the camera. I'm getting it back in a couple of weeks. I'm itching to get it back.
Yeah. No, I'm missing it. I slightly fell in love with that camera, I have to say.
Yep. Absolutely. Right. Well, I'm sure you will be getting one very soon after launch. So thank you all for watching. Thank you very much, Ollie, for joining me. And like I said, if you have any more questions, leave them down in the comment section down below. And if you want to buy an R5c for yourself, head over to Pro V. Thank you for joining me, Ollie. I'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
microphone.